Chapter 7. It was Dragonfly who saw the man first, for as I told you, he had the sharpest eyes of any of us. Psst, he hissed. There's a funny-looking man. He dropped flat on the ground, which was a signal for all of us to do the same. It didn't do Poetry much good to lie down, though, because anybody couldn't help but see him. There was a man, all right, about 20 yards from the sycamore, and walking straight toward it, or rather, he was just walking along kind of lazy-like, but going toward the tree just the same. He was whistling a tune that sounded like Old Black Joe. Big Jim turned his face around toward us, raised his finger, and said, "Shh." And his eyes said, "Don't you dare make a noise, any of you." Then he handed the binoculars back to me. I noticed particularly that the man looked awful young to be a bank robber, and that he had coal black hair. When we'd all had a good look with the binoculars, we knew that something was really mysterious, for the man was poking around inside the old tree. "He's looking for something," Poetry said. Maybe thinking of the whiskers and glasses and wig. It's a good thing the grass was tall where we were, or the man might have seen us. For suddenly he stopped what he was doing and looked around quick, as if he'd heard something. Then he walked away, following the creek and still whistling. Something must have scared him, though, for pretty soon he started to run for all he was worth. I guess we lay there for maybe 5 minutes more, waiting for Big Jim to say we could get up. I could tell from the expression on his face that he was thinking hard. Then he said, It won't do for us to act like we know anything special. Let's just get up and act natural, like a bunch of boys having a good time." Circus was about the only one of us that didn't have any trouble acting natural. When he was trying to, he yawned, stretched, and said, "Boy, it feels good to lie here in the shade." Only there wasn't any shade there at all, except what Poetry made. So, with all of us acting natural, or nearly so, we just moved along gang-fashioned until we got to the tree. Big Jim made us all stand back and keep on trying to act natural, which was pretty hard to do. We could hear him feeling around the hole in the tree with little Jim's stick, pretending soon he let out a low whistle. Pretty soon he let out a low whistle, and I saw him shove something into his pocket and keep right on digging around. There was a strange look on his face when he came back to where we were. Then all of a sudden there was a gunshot up the creek, then another and another. It didn't take us long to get back to the spring, I can tell you, for that look on Big Jim's face and those gunshots scared us plenty. We were all so excited we could hardly talk, which was all right because we were supposed to do nothing but run anyway, which we did. At the spring, we sat down to rest, and Big Jim took a dirty brown envelope out of his pocket. He started to open it, and then we all jumped, for we could hear footsteps coming up along the top of the hill. We sat there so tense we couldn't move, but then Big Jim shoved the envelope into his pocket and started whistling. Poetry rolled over on his side, yawned, and said, "Boy, I'm sleepy. In winter, I get up at night and dress by yellow candlelight. In summer, quiet the other way, I have to go to bed by day." Little Jim slid over to Big Jim, and his right hand crept into Big Jim's hand, probably so he wouldn't feel so scared. Circus and Dragonfly started a wrestling match, and I took my binoculars and focused them on a snake that was swimming along in the creek. The snake must have seen or heard us, for he ducked under the water and didn't come up again until he was almost all the way across and about 10 feet farther down the creek. All this time the footsteps were coming nearer. I guess we were all pretty relieved when we looked up and saw it was just my dad, with a big pail in his hand, coming for spring water. He stood looking at us, at our sign on the big tree, and at the paper drinking cups. Then he filled his pail and said, casual like, "You'd better come home at 5:30 tonight, Bill. This is Thursday, you know." You see, Thursday night is prayer meeting night in our church. Some kids might think it's kind of goofy to be going to prayer meeting, but I didn't because I'd been going ever since I was old enough to be carried there. And when you've got a mother and father like mine, you think prayer meeting on Thursday night is all right. In fact, I felt sorry for circuses folks. They didn't go any places on Thursday nights, except to places where they shouldn't go. Circus's dad especially. He was always getting drunk. Circus's mom really tried to be a good mother. They had several children, and all of them were girls but one. Circus's folks didn't know anything at all about the Bible. It didn't seem fair for a boy to have that kind of parents. But that's the kind Circus had. All he knew about the Bible was what he'd learned from Little Jim and poetry and me. But mostly from Little Jim. Circus had quit swearing because Little Jim didn't like to hear it. Circus was the only one of our gang that did swear. And as quick as Circus knew it was wrong, he quit. Just as my dad reached the top of the hill with his pail of water, he turned around and said, without even sounding excited, "Maybe you boys would be interested to know that about 20 minutes ago the sheriff caught a boy bank robber down along the swamp. The robber is on his way to the hospital to get well of his wounds. They had to shoot him, and then it'll be jail." Little Jim looked pale. When Dad was gone, he said, I hope he doesn't die without being sorry. Mother says unless a man repents of his sin and lets Jesus come into his heart before he dies, he won't ever be saved and can't go to heaven at all. After little Jim said that, we all kept still for a minute, thinking different things. I wondered whether the bank robber's mother would go to jail to see him. How awful it would make her feel to have that kind of boy. I wished every boy in the world had a mother like mine or little Jim's or Poetry's. I bet they wouldn't be any bad boys in the world if they did. We decided we'd better find a more secluded place than the spring before we opened that brown envelope. At the spring, you can never tell when somebody's going to come for a drink. So we climbed to the top of the hill over on the east side of the woods and stood around the big rock where we sometimes had our meetings. In a few minutes, we were looking at a rough drawing of some kind with scrawling writing on it. Right in the middle of the page was a bed that looked like a hospital bed, and in the bed was an old man with a nurse standing there holding a glass of water. The old man was saying, "More, please." Alongside the bed was a funny crooked line twisting along like a snake, and a little bird in a tree close by singing "Sweet, sweet, sweet." There are letters and numbers and other lines running off from the one that looked like a snake. "It doesn't make any sense," Poetry exclaimed. It looked like he was right. I kept watching Big Jim's face, for I knew he was thinking. Big Jim had the kindest face you ever saw, with clear blue eyes and a chin that had a big dimple right in the middle of it. There wasn't any sense to be noticed, to my noticing. The black fuzz on his upper lip, there wasn't any sense to my noticing the black fuzz on his upper lip when I should have been thinking about the map or whatever it was supposed to be, unless it was because some people call other people's faces maps. Anyway, I was thinking that Big Jim was old enough almost to begin shaving, and I envied his being that old. That little mustache meant that Big Jim was almost a man. I guess every boy can hardly wait till he gets to be a man. Again, it was Dragonfly who saw it first. Suddenly he was jumping up and down and hollering, "I've got it! I've got it!" Big Jim shushed him up quick. All of us did, in fact. "Look," Dragonfly said more quietly. "That nurse standing there means the old man is sick. He's asking for more water. And if you put sick and more together, you have sycamore. It stands for that old tree." I guess we were all plenty excited right that minute. And we must have made a lot of noise because Big Jim said, "Calm down!" Now that Dragonfly had seen it, it was as plain as day to the rest of us. And Dragonfly stuttered, That snake crawling is a river, and the bird singing sweet, sweet, sweet means Sugar Creek. Figuring out that map was like fitting together a jigsaw puzzle, only it was harder. We were all sitting there on the rock now with the map spread out between us, racking our brains to decide what the funny lines and words meant. From the tree to the drawing, there was an arrow with the number 20 written on it, pointing straight east. That is, if the directions on the map were the same as those on an ordinary map. At the end of the arrow was the word China, and that didn't make any sense. Not until little Jim said, quiet like, as if he was afraid somebody would make fun of him. Of his idea. My daddy's brother is a missionary in China, and Daddy says China's right straight down through the center of the earth. Without knowing, he had solved the puzzle for us, for that meant go 20 feet east and dig straight down, and there we'd find whatever it was. The money, maybe, which had been stolen from the bank. We all jumped up and started toward the sycamore tree, with Big Jim in the lead, having to go slow because little Jim couldn't run as fast as the rest of us. We got there in about 6 minutes, or a little more. Well, there we were without a ruler or a tape measure, so how could we know how far 20 feet was without something to measure with? We weren't nearly as scared as we had been when we were at the sycamore the first time, since we knew the robber had been caught, but we were plenty scared. Somebody'll have to run home for a ruler or a tape measure, Big Jim said. We all looked at each other. None of us wanted to go, knowing it was so near supper time that whoever went might not get to come back. His folks might not understand how important this was, and he couldn't tell them. Let's roll poetry over 7 times, and that'd make 21 feet, 'cause he's 3 feet round, Circus suggested. Poetry turned red and gave Circus a savage look. I'm 35 inches, he said disgustedly, and you wouldn't know your arithmetic, and you wouldn't know your arithmetic well enough to divide 20 feet by 35 inches. I'm just 4 feet tall, little Jim said. In a jiffy he was lying down with his feet against the sycamore, and with his body pointing straight east. Well, that looked like a good idea, so we just used little Jim for a measuring stick, and soon we were what was supposed to be 20 feet from the sycamore tree. Poetry lay down and rolled over 7 times 2, just to show he was a good sport. And there wasn't much difference between the two measurements. But we knew that somehow we figured wrong. All around the grass was fresh and green, and nobody had ever buried anything there, unless it was a long time ago. So maybe the map meant 20 yards instead of 20 feet. Big Jim looked around at his watch, then at me, and said, 5:30. We'll all have to go home for supper. Of course, we felt disappointed, but we agreed to meet again the next afternoon at 1 o'clock, if we could. Big Jim would bring along a 50-foot tape measure, his father being a carpenter. I'll bring a gunny sack to put the money in, little Jim volunteered. We didn't laugh at him, because sometimes his ideas turned out to be all right.